The man standing before George Washington looked exactly like the kind of officer the struggling American Revolution desperately needed. He wore the bearing of a Prussian professional. His movements were precise. His confidence never wavered. In his hands, he carried a letter of introduction that suggested he had served as a lieutenant general under Frederick the Great himself, the king whose army had become the standard every European power tried to imitate. If even part of that reputation was true, then the Continental Army had just found the experienced commander it had been praying for. There was only one problem. He wasn't a Prussian lieutenant general. In fact, he had never even been a general. Yet this same man would transform a starving, exhausted collection of volunteers into the army that would eventually defeat the British Empire. Without commanding a single great battlefield victory himself, he would change the way Americans marched, loaded their muskets, fought with bayonets, obeyed orders, and survived under fire. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. One of the greatest military reformers in American history arrived carrying a title he had never earned. But by the time he left, the United States would make that title real. To understand how a man with an exaggerated resume helped win the American Revolution, you have to begin in the coldest winter the Continental Army had ever endured. Valley Forge, February 1778. The Revolution was alive, but barely. Snow covered the rolling hills northwest of Philadelphia, hiding frozen earth beneath a thin white blanket that looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, it revealed an army collapsing under hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Thousands of soldiers lived in rough log huts built with green timber that still leaked freezing air through the cracks. Smoke drifted weakly from crude stone chimneys that often failed to keep the interiors warm. Blankets were scarce, shoes were even scarcer. Many men wrapped bloody feet in rags before reporting for duty. Others left dark stains in the snow simply because they no longer had anything covering their feet at all. Visitors arriving at Valley Forge expected to find an army. Instead, many found something closer to a refugee camp with muskets. Disease spread relentlessly through the encampment. Typhus, influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia cut through the ranks with almost as much efficiency as British cannon. Food shortages became routine. Salt meat arrived spoiled. Flour shipments failed to appear. Entire companies sometimes survived on little more than fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked over open coals that offered just enough calories to keep a man standing for another day. Yet, starvation was only part of the crisis. The deeper problem could not be measured by empty stomachs. George Washington commanded brave men. He did not command a professional army. The Continental Army had been assembled from every corner of the 13 colonies. Massachusetts militia stood beside Virginians. Riflemen from Pennsylvania served alongside recruits from Connecticut and Maryland. They spoke with different accents, followed different military traditions, and had often been trained by entirely different officers. Nothing was standardized. One regiment loaded muskets one way, another used a different sequence. Some officers issued commands that neighboring units barely recognized. Even basic marching formations varied from colony to colony. In battle, those differences became deadly. A professional European army relied on precision. Thousands of soldiers had to move as though they shared one mind. They had to reload their muskets almost automatically while cannon fire tore gaps through their ranks. They had to wheel, pivot, advance, and withdraw without dissolving into confusion. Every second mattered. Every mistake multiplied across the line. The British Army had spent generations mastering those skills. Most American soldiers had not. Courage alone could not compensate for disorder. Washington understood this better than anyone. He had watched inexperienced regiments fight bravely, only to lose cohesion at the worst possible moment. He had seen officers contradict one another because no universal system existed. Every campaign exposed the same weakness. His men were willing to fight for independence. They simply had not been taught how to fight together, and Britain knew it. Only months earlier, General William Howe had captured Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. New York remained firmly under British control. The Royal Navy dominated the coastline, moving troops wherever it pleased. The disastrous defeats around New York in 1776 still haunted Washington's army, while the victories at Trenton and Princeton, remarkable as they were, had not erased the enormous imbalance between Britain's seasoned regulars and America's inexperienced soldiers. The Revolution had survived. Winning it was another matter entirely. European observers doubted the rebellion could last. Some believed Washington was delaying the inevitable. Others admired his determination, but privately questioned whether an army built from farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers could ever stand against one of the finest military machines in the world. Washington himself knew exactly what his army lacked. What he did not know was where he would find the man capable of fixing it. That answer arrived after crossing the Atlantic. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben. He called himself Baron von Steuben. He carried impeccable manners, impressive military knowledge, and a recommendation that opened doors from Paris to Valley Forge. It also created an impression that was not entirely true. The letter described him in terms that led many Americans to believe they were welcoming one of Frederick the Great's senior generals. Washington had every reason to believe it. Europe did too. But hidden behind the polished uniform and aristocratic title was a much more complicated story. The man who had come to save the Continental Army had never commanded one. If George Washington believed a famous Prussian general had just ridden into Valley Forge, he was hardly alone. The reputation surrounding Baron von Steuben had been carefully built long before he ever stepped onto American soil. His recommendations carried extraordinary weight. European diplomats praised his experience. Influential supporters described him as a man shaped by Frederick the Great's legendary military machine. To leaders who desperately needed someone capable of rebuilding their army, the message seemed obvious. Here was a veteran who had mastered the finest military system in Europe. The truth was both less impressive and far more interesting. Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben was born on September 17, 1730, in the fortress town of Magdeburg in the Kingdom of Prussia. Unlike many aristocratic officers who entered military service through privilege alone, Friedrich spent much of his childhood following his father, Wilhelm von Steuben, an engineer officer in the Prussian Army. While other children learned court etiquette, Friedrich wandered through military camps. He watched engineers survey terrain before fortifications were built. He listened as officers debated logistics, supply routes, artillery positions, and troop movements. Maps, drills, and discipline became part of everyday life long before he wore a uniform himself. Prussia offered little room for mediocrity. King Frederick II, better known to history as Frederick the Great, had transformed his kingdom into one of Europe's most formidable military powers. Surrounded by larger rivals, Prussia survived not through superior numbers, but through relentless professionalism. Every regiment drilled until movements became instinct. Officers were expected to know every detail of administration, logistics, formations, and battlefield control. Mistakes that other armies tolerated could end careers in Prussia. It was an unforgiving system. It also produced some of the finest soldiers in Europe. When the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756, young von Steuben entered active service. The conflict would eventually stretch across Europe, North America, Africa, India, and the Caribbean. Historians often describe it as the first true global war. For Prussia, however, it became a desperate struggle for survival. Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony all sought to destroy Frederick's kingdom. Again and again, Prussian armies faced enemies that outnumbered them. Victory depended on discipline, not courage alone. Von Steuben served through years of brutal campaigning, witnessing firsthand how Frederick's army functioned under the greatest pressure imaginable. He learned how experienced officers maintained formations under artillery fire, how supply systems kept armies moving, how inspections uncovered weaknesses before battles, and why discipline meant far more than blind obedience. In the Prussian system, discipline created predictability. Every soldier knew exactly what the man beside him would do. That consistency won battles. By the end of the war, von Steuben had earned respect inside the army. But respect was not the same as extraordinary rank. Despite later legends, he never became one of Frederick's great battlefield commanders. He was not a field marshal. He was not a lieutenant general. He was not entrusted with commanding entire armies. Historical records show that his highest permanent rank in Prussian service was captain. During parts of the war, he also worked in staff positions that exposed him to higher-level planning, giving him valuable experience far beyond what many officers of similar rank received. He observed how senior commanders organized campaigns, coordinated movements, managed inspections, and maintained discipline across thousands of men. Those lessons would prove far more valuable than a title. After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Prussia sharply reduced the size of its army. Thousands of officers suddenly found themselves without meaningful prospects. Von Steuben left active service and accepted a position with the small German principality of Hohenzollern-Hechingen, where he became Grand Marshal of the prince's household. The role sounded prestigious, but it was largely administrative. He supervised finances, ceremonies, and the management of a minor royal court rather than soldiers in the field. The contrast could not have been greater. Only a few years earlier, he had served within Europe's most respected military establishment. Now he managed court protocol. Financial difficulties soon followed. The prince's resources were limited, and von Steuben's own lifestyle often exceeded his income. By the mid-1770s, he was searching for new opportunities across Europe. He approached several foreign courts, including Austria and Baden, hoping to secure military employment. None offered the position he wanted. His career appeared to be fading. Then, chance intervened. In Paris, American diplomats were quietly searching for experienced European officers willing to aid the revolution. Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane had already recruited several foreign volunteers, but not all had justified their reputations. Washington needed professionals, not adventurers chasing glory. Von Steuben seemed different. He possessed genuine knowledge of Europe's finest army. What he lacked was a sufficiently impressive title. So the distinction became blurred. His supporters emphasized his service under Frederick the Great, his work on the Prussian general staff, and his experience with military administration. None of those claims were invented, but together they created an impression larger than the reality. To many readers, the recommendation suggested a senior Prussian commander, when, in truth, it described an exceptionally capable staff officer whose expertise far exceeded the rank he had held. Whether that ambiguity was deliberate or simply convenient remains debated by historians. What is certain is this: without that carefully crafted reputation, Friedrich von Steuben might never have reached America. And without America, the world might never have known his name. When Baron von Steuben first walked through the camp at Valley Forge, he did not see an army waiting to be trained. He saw hundreds of small armies trapped inside one camp. The men all wore the same cause on their sleeves, but almost nothing else was consistent. One regiment marched differently from the next. Officers shouted conflicting commands. Soldiers loaded identical muskets using different sequences they had learned back home. Even something as basic as forming a battle line could become slow and chaotic, because neighboring units often followed entirely different drill systems. To an American volunteer, these differences seemed harmless. To a Prussian officer, they were terrifying. On a battlefield, confusion killed long before bullets did. The British understood this better than anyone. For decades, the British Army had drilled until every movement became automatic. The soldier did not stop to think about how to load his musket or where to stand in line. His body already knew. That discipline allowed British battalions to maintain formation while cannonballs tore gaps through their ranks. Officers could maneuver thousands of men almost as if they were controlling a single machine. The Continental Army had courage. The British Army had rhythm, and rhythm often won battles. Von Steuben spent his first days doing something few senior officers ever bothered to do. He watched. He stood beside drilling companies without interrupting them. He followed officers during inspections. He examined weapons, uniforms, supply wagons, campsites, kitchens, and latrines. He asked questions through translators because he spoke almost no English. What little English he did know quickly dissolved whenever he became frustrated. which happened often. The deeper he looked, the more serious the problems became. Weapons were filthy. Many muskets had not been cleaned properly in weeks. Black powder residue clogged the barrels. Flintlocks were poorly maintained. Bayonets were rusty or loose. Soldiers often carried equipment in completely different ways because no standard existed for arranging cartridge boxes, canteens, blankets, or packs. Even the camps themselves revealed disorder. Refuse accumulated too close to living quarters. Kitchens operated without consistent organization. Latrines were often positioned where they contaminated nearby water or spread disease through the camp. To many officers, these seemed like minor inconveniences. Von Steuben knew they were military problems. Disease could destroy an army just as effectively as combat. A sick soldier fired no musket. An exhausted soldier marched no farther. Every unnecessary death weakened Washington before the battle even began. The Prussian did not criticize these failures out of arrogance. He understood why they existed. Most American officers had never expected to command thousands of men. Many had been lawyers, merchants, farmers, surveyors, or local militia leaders only a few years earlier. They possessed determination, local authority, and courage, but almost none had received the kind of systematic military education common among Europe's professional officer corps. The revolution had created an army faster than it could create experienced commanders. Someone had to teach both. Washington quickly recognized something unusual about his new volunteer. Unlike many European officers who arrived expecting high rank and immediate command, von Steuben asked for neither. He wanted permission to train, nothing more. Washington agreed. If the experiment failed, little would be lost. If it succeeded, everything might change. Von Steuben immediately rejected the obvious approach. He did not attempt to drill the entire army at once. That would have been impossible. Instead, he selected approximately 100 men from different regiments to form what became known as the Model Company. Every soldier chosen remained part of his original unit. That detail mattered enormously. Von Steuben's plan was never to create one elite regiment. He intended to create 100 instructors. The Model Company trained every day under his direct supervision. From sunrise until evening, the same movements were repeated again and again. How to stand, how to shoulder a musket, how to align a rank, how to march without breaking formation, how to wheel left, how to wheel right, how to advance while maintaining intervals, how to recover instantly after confusion. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was considered too basic. Many Americans found the repetition exhausting. Von Steuben considered it essential. Under pressure, soldiers never rose to the level of their ambitions. They fell to the level of their training. Communication presented another challenge. Von Steuben spoke German and French. Most of the soldiers spoke English. The language barrier could easily have destroyed the entire project. Instead, it became one of the camp's most memorable stories. The Baron barked instructions in rapid German or French, growing louder whenever mistakes appeared. His aides translated those commands into English, though often with a slight delay. When words failed him completely, von Steuben relied on gestures, demonstrations, and expressions that required no translation at all. According to several contemporaries, his colorful, multilingual outbursts became legendary throughout the camp, often causing nearby soldiers to hide smiles even while they scrambled to correct their mistakes. Yet behind the humor lay relentless standards. Von Steuben never demonstrated a movement he had not already perfected himself. He marched beside the men. He showed officers exactly how every command should sound. He physically repositioned soldiers until every line was straight. Mistakes were corrected immediately, not to humiliate anyone, but to prevent those mistakes from becoming habits. His greatest innovation, however, was directed not at the enlisted men, but at the officers. In many European armies, officers often remained socially distant from ordinary soldiers. Von Steuben rejected that attitude at Valley Forge. He expected officers to understand every drill before asking their men to perform it. If a captain could not execute a maneuver correctly, he had no right to demand perfection from his company. Leadership, in von Steuben's view, began with competence, not privilege. The effect spread faster than Washington had expected. Within weeks, the men of the model company returned to their own regiments and repeated exactly what they had learned. Those regiments trained others. Then those soldiers instructed still more companies. Instead of relying on one instructor, the Continental Army suddenly possessed dozens, then hundreds. For the first time since the revolution had begun, every regiment was beginning to speak the same military language. The transformation was still incomplete. The British remained stronger, the Continental Army remained hungry. But something fundamental had changed inside Valley Forge. The collection of separate colonial forces was slowly becoming one army, and soon it would have the chance to prove it under fire. By the beginning of March 1778, something unusual was happening at Valley Forge. The shouting had become more organized. Instead of dozens of officers giving conflicting commands, entire companies now moved to the same rhythm. The endless confusion that had once filled the parade grounds was slowly giving way to something far more dangerous: uniformity. Not in uniforms, in behavior. Von Steuben understood a truth that professional armies had spent centuries learning. Battles are not won because soldiers remember complicated plans. They are won because ordinary men perform simple actions flawlessly while everything around them is collapsing. His goal was not to make Americans look like Prussians. It was to remove hesitation. Every second a soldier spent wondering what to do was another second the enemy could exploit. So he stripped every movement down to its essentials. Loading a musket became a carefully choreographed sequence. Draw the cartridge. Bite it open, prime the pan, pour the remaining powder into the barrel, insert the ball, draw the ramrod, seat the charge. Return the ramrod, bring the musket to the shoulder, present, fire. Every motion followed the previous one without interruption. There was no room for improvisation. Under stress, men forgot instructions. They remembered habits. British regulars could often fire 3 or even 4 aimed shots per minute because every movement had become instinct after years of drilling. Many Continental soldiers had previously struggled to maintain even half that pace while keeping their formations intact. Von Steuben never promised miracles. He promised consistency, and consistency could be practiced again, again, again. Entire afternoons disappeared into repetition. To an outside observer, it looked painfully monotonous. To von Steuben, every repetition reduced the chance that a frightened soldier would freeze during battle. Then came the bayonet. Nothing revealed the weakness of the Continental Army more clearly. Many American soldiers viewed the bayonet as little more than an accessory attached to the end of the musket. Some had barely practiced using it. Others had never received proper instruction at all. The British knew this. Again and again, British infantry had broken American positions simply by advancing with fixed bayonets. Often, very little actual stabbing occurred. The psychological effect alone was devastating. Militia units, uncertain how to respond, sometimes broke before contact was even made. Von Steuben intended to end that forever. He ordered the men to fix bayonets. Then he made them charge, again, and again, and again. They learned how to thrust without losing balance, how to recover immediately after the first attack, how to keep the line moving instead of stopping after contact, how to trust the men standing on both sides. He shouted constantly, not because he enjoyed shouting, because confidence had to replace fear. A bayonet charge only worked if hundreds of men believed everyone else would continue forward. If one company hesitated, the entire line could collapse. Discipline was courage multiplied, but battlefield drill was only part of the transformation. Von Steuben also attacked problems few glamorous military histories ever discuss. He reorganized the camps themselves. Kitchen areas were moved and standardized. Refuse pits were placed farther from living quarters. Latrines were relocated to reduce contamination of water sources. Supply storage became more orderly. Cooking routines were regulated. Inspection schedules became stricter. Modern readers might dismiss these changes as housekeeping. 18th century soldiers knew better. Disease had killed more armies than bullets. A cleaner camp meant fewer sick men, Fewer sick men meant more muskets available when the British attacked. Military efficiency began long before the battlefield. Perhaps the greatest surprise for many officers was that von Steuben refused to excuse incompetence simply because someone held rank. One morning, according to several contemporary accounts, he watched an officer repeatedly give unclear commands during drill. The soldiers became confused. The formation drifted apart. Instead of blaming the men, von Steuben stopped the exercise. He walked directly toward the officer. Then, standing in front of the entire company, he demonstrated the maneuver himself, not to embarrass him, to make one lesson unmistakably clear. If the officer failed, the soldiers would fail. Leadership began with example. Washington admired this approach. For months, he had struggled with officers whose enthusiasm exceeded their experience. Promotions during the Revolution often reflected politics, local influence, or urgent necessity, rather than formal military education. Von Steuben quietly began correcting that imbalance without creating unnecessary resentment. He taught captains how to inspect equipment, majors how to organize training, colonels how to move entire regiments efficiently. He explained not only what to do, but why it mattered. That why changed everything. Soldiers who understood the purpose behind a maneuver learned faster. Officers who understood the reason behind discipline enforced it more intelligently. The Continental Army was no longer memorizing isolated drills. It was learning a complete military system. To preserve that system, von Steuben began writing everything down. Working with secretaries and translators, he transformed months of practical instruction into a clear manual that officers throughout the Army could follow. Commands, formations, camp layouts, inspections, weapon handling, guard duty, marching procedures, every essential lesson found its place. This manual would later become known simply as the Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, though generations of American soldiers would refer to it by a much simpler name. The Blue Book. For decades, it would remain the foundation of military training in the United States Army. But manuals alone never proved their value. Paper did not stop bayonets. Ink did not defeat British veterans. Only battle could answer the question that mattered. Had Valley Forge truly created a new army? Or merely taught starving men how to march in straighter lines? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. And it would arrive under the blazing June sun at Monmouth, where British regulars would discover that the frightened volunteers they had fought only a year earlier no longer existed. When the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it did not look dramatically different. The uniforms were still mismatched. Many soldiers still wore patched coats, worn-out shoes, or no shoes at all. Supplies remained inconsistent. Pay was months behind. Disease had not disappeared overnight, and neither had hunger. To a British observer watching from a distance, very little had changed. That illusion would not survive the first major battle. For nearly 6 months, Baron von Steuben had rebuilt the army from the inside out. He had not given Washington more soldiers. He had not provided better muskets or larger cannons. What he had created was something far less visible. Predictability. Every regiment now followed the same drill. Every officer issued the same commands. Every company understood where it belonged in formation. For the first time since the Revolution began, Washington could expect different units from different states to react in exactly the same way. That single change transformed everything. Then, in June 1778, the strategic situation shifted. The British abandoned Philadelphia. After France formally entered the war on the American side earlier that year, London faced a much larger conflict. British commanders could no longer concentrate solely on crushing the rebellion. The Royal Navy suddenly had to prepare for the possibility of fighting the French fleet across the Atlantic and in Europe. General Sir Henry Clinton, who had replaced William Howe as commander of British forces in North America, received new orders. Philadelphia was no longer worth holding. Instead, Clinton would evacuate the city and march nearly 10,000 British and Hessian troops northeast toward New York, where the Army could be more easily supported by the Royal Navy. For Washington, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. For almost 3 years, he had avoided risking the destruction of the Continental Army in a decisive battle. Now the British would be marching across the hot New Jersey countryside with a long baggage train stretching for miles behind them. Washington intended to strike. Not everyone agreed. Several senior officers argued that attacking Britain's best troops in open ground was reckless. The memory of defeats at Long Island, Brandywine, and Germantown remained painfully fresh. British regulars had repeatedly demonstrated their superiority on the battlefield. But Washington believed circumstances had changed. He trusted his army more than he ever had before. The question was whether that confidence was justified. The two forces finally collided near the village of Monmouth Courthouse on June 28, 1778. The heat alone was almost unbearable. Temperatures climbed above 90 degrees Fahrenheit under a relentless summer sun. Soldiers marched through choking dust with heavy wool uniforms, muskets, ammunition, and packs weighing more than many modern infantrymen carry today. Before the fighting even reached its peak, men on both sides began collapsing from heat exhaustion. Some never stood up again. Washington initially ordered Major General Charles Lee to attack the British rear guard while the main Continental force followed behind. Almost immediately, confusion erupted. Lee received conflicting reports about British movements. Units lost contact with one another. Orders became uncertain. Instead of mounting a coordinated attack, parts of the American advance hesitated while others pushed forward independently. Within hours, the situation deteriorated into a disorderly withdrawal. For a brief moment, it seemed as though another American defeat was unfolding. Then, George Washington arrived. According to multiple eyewitnesses, he encountered retreating troops streaming back toward the main army and demanded to know what had happened. Furious at the confusion, Washington personally rode forward, reorganized the collapsing line, reassigned commands, and prepared to face the pursuing British. This became one of the most dramatic moments of the Revolution. But something extraordinary happened next. The Continental Army stopped running. Not because the British had slowed, because the Americans had learned how to stand. Regiments wheeled into position with a discipline that would have been almost unimaginable the previous year. Officers issued commands that every company recognized immediately. Lines dressed themselves quickly. Artillery found supporting positions. Infantry maintained intervals instead of dissolving into scattered groups. British officers noticed the difference almost at once. These were not the same troops they had driven from New York. Nor were they the same army that had struggled through earlier campaigns. Again and again, British infantry advanced, expecting the familiar collapse of American formations. Again and again, the Continental line held. The fighting became brutal. Musket volleys crashed across open fields at close range. Cannon fired canister into advancing infantry. Smoke settled over the battlefield so heavily that entire formations disappeared behind drifting white clouds before suddenly emerging again, only yards apart. Several American units executed controlled withdrawals under pressure, then reformed exactly as they had practiced at Valley Forge. Others advanced with fixed bayonets instead of breaking before British charges. It was not flawless. Mistakes still occurred. Individual officers still failed, but the army itself no longer unraveled. Late in the afternoon, the exhausted British finally disengaged and continued their march toward New York during the night. Neither side had won a decisive tactical victory. Yet, strategically, Monmouth changed everything. For the first time in a major open-field battle, the Continental Army had stood toe-to-toe with Britain's professional regulars for an entire day without collapsing. European observers took notice. So did Washington. He understood exactly what he had witnessed. The transformation had not occurred because his soldiers had suddenly become braver. They had always been brave. The difference was that bravery now rested on discipline. One veteran later summarized the change in remarkably simple terms. The army had learned to trust itself. No single moment at Monmouth could be credited entirely to Baron von Steuben. Washington's leadership, the determination of countless officers, and the endurance of ordinary soldiers all shaped the outcome. but almost every movement that kept the Continental Line intact bore his fingerprints. The drills, the formations, the standardized commands, the confidence to reload under fire, the willingness to meet a bayonet charge instead of fleeing from it. Those lessons had been forged during the frozen months at Valley Forge. Now they had survived the ultimate examination. The British had not been defeated. But they had discovered something even more dangerous. America finally possessed an army worthy of the name, and Baron von Steuben's greatest contribution was still ahead of him. The Battle of Monmouth did not end the American Revolution. It proved something far more important. The Continental Army had stopped being an experiment. For 3 years, Britain's commanders had operated under one fundamental assumption. Given enough pressure, enough disciplined volleys, or one well-timed bayonet charge, American formations would eventually break apart. They had seen it happen on Long Island. They had seen it at Brandywine. They had seen it again and again whenever inexperienced regiments were forced into prolonged combat against seasoned regulars. At Monmouth, that assumption failed, not because Britain had become weaker, because Washington's army had become stronger. The victory was psychological as much as military. British officers now faced an enemy that could maneuver, hold its line, and recover from confusion instead of collapsing under it. Every future campaign would have to account for that reality. For Baron von Steuben, however, the work was far from over. Training an army was one achievement. Keeping it trained was another. The Continental Army was constantly changing. Enlistments expired, veterans returned home. New recruits arrived with no military experience at all. Officers were promoted, transferred, wounded, or killed. Without a permanent system, everything learned at Valley Forge could disappear within months. Von Steuben refused to let that happen. Throughout 1778 and 1779, he transformed months of practical instruction into a comprehensive manual unlike anything the Continental Army had possessed before. Officially, it was titled Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. Soldiers gave it a much simpler name: the Blue Book. Bound in blue covers, it became the first standardized military manual in American history. Its importance is difficult to overstate. Before the Blue Book, much of military knowledge lived inside the heads of individual officers. If an experienced commander died, retired, or transferred, his methods often disappeared with him. Von Steuben changed that completely. Now, every regiment could train from the same instructions. Every officer could study the same procedures. Every recruit could be taught using the same sequence of drills. The manual covered far more than marching. It explained how companies should form for battle, how guards should be posted, how inspections were conducted, how camps were organized, how officers should supervise equipment, how sentries reported information, how troops should maneuver during combat, even seemingly ordinary routines, morning inspections, cleaning weapons, arranging tents, issuing supplies, received clear, standardized procedures. To many civilians, these details sounded painfully dull. Professional soldiers recognized them as the invisible framework that kept an army functioning. Washington certainly did. His confidence in von Steuben continued to grow. The Baron was appointed Inspector General of the Continental Army, giving him authority to oversee training across the entire force. Rather than remaining in one camp, he traveled between units, inspected regiments, corrected deficiencies, advised commanders, and ensured that the standards established at Valley Forge spread throughout the army. He became, in effect, the guardian of consistency. That role demanded diplomacy as much as military skill. Many American officers were proud men. Some had commanded troops since the opening days of the Revolution. Others came from influential families or held political connections within their states. A foreign volunteer openly criticizing their methods could easily have created resentment. Von Steuben understood this. Although famous for his explosive temper during drill, he was remarkably skilled at dealing with senior officers. Rather than humiliating them publicly, he usually explained the practical benefits of new procedures. He demonstrated improvements personally. He listened when experienced commanders suggested adaptations for American conditions. He did not try to turn the Continental Army into a copy of Frederick the Great's army. He built a professional American army instead. That distinction mattered. European battlefields often relied on rigid traditions developed over generations. America fought a different war. Its armies operated across enormous distances with limited resources. Supply shortages were constant. Militia frequently fought alongside regular troops. Officers had to adapt to forests, rivers, poor roads, and long campaigns where logistics often mattered more than parade ground perfection. Von Steuben recognized those realities. His system combined European discipline with American practicality. That flexibility would become invaluable. By 1780, the war had shifted south. British strategy focused increasingly on Georgia and the Carolinas, hoping loyalist support would collapse the revolution from below. Campaigns became longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. American forces suffered painful defeats, but unlike earlier years, those defeats rarely destroyed entire armies. The institutional backbone created after Valley Forge endured. Wherever Continental regulars marched, the same drill followed them, the same commands, the same formations, the same discipline. Then came 1781. A British army under Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis established fortified positions at Yorktown, Virginia, expecting continued support from the Royal Navy. Instead, events began moving against him. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse gained temporary control of the Chesapeake Bay, preventing British naval reinforcement or evacuation. At the same time, Washington and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, executed one of the most remarkable strategic marches of the war, moving thousands of Allied troops south before British leaders fully realized their true objective. Yorktown soon became a trap. As American and French forces surrounded Cornwallis, siege operations began. Trenches crept steadily closer to British defenses. Artillery pounded the fortifications day after day. Every advance required coordination. Every assault depended on disciplined formations operating under intense pressure. The Continental Army that entered those trenches was no longer the force that had staggered into Valley Forge 3 winters earlier. It moved with confidence. Its officers shared a common language of command. Its regiments could cooperate efficiently with experienced French troops because they themselves had become professionals. Von Steuben did not personally win the siege of Yorktown. Neither did Washington alone, nor Rochambeau, nor de Grasse. Victory emerged because diplomacy, strategy, logistics, naval power, engineering, artillery, and a disciplined army finally converged at exactly the right moment. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. Although smaller campaigns continued, Yorktown effectively ended Britain's attempt to suppress the revolution by force. When historians explain why America won its independence, they often point to French intervention, Washington's leadership, or Britain's global commitments. All are correct, but none of those advantages could have mattered if the Continental Army had remained incapable of fighting as a professional force. The revolution needed allies, it needed strategy, it needed luck, but it also needed soldiers who could execute orders under fire. That army did not exist in 1777. By 1781, it did. And much of that transformation could be traced back to one Prussian officer who had arrived carrying a reputation larger than his actual rank, but whose knowledge proved even greater than his reputation. On paper, Baron von Steuben had arrived in America as something he was not. History remembers him as something far greater. When the guns finally fell silent after Yorktown, the United States had won its independence. But victory did not erase the enormous challenges facing the new nation. Congress was nearly bankrupt. The Continental Army was shrinking as soldiers returned home. Many foreign officers who had crossed the Atlantic in search of glory quietly departed for Europe, believing their work was finished. Von Steuben chose a different path. He stayed. Not because America offered wealth, it did not. For years after the war, Congress struggled even to compensate him for his service. Like thousands of Continental officers, he spent long periods waiting for payments that arrived slowly, if at all. At times, his financial situation became so uncertain that friends stepped in to help cover basic expenses. The man who had helped build America's army often struggled simply to support himself. It was a bitter irony. Washington never forgot what he had done. Neither did Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, Nathaniel Greene, and many of the officers who had trained under him at Valley Forge. Again and again, they reminded Congress that the discipline holding the Continental Army together during the final years of the Revolution had not appeared by accident. Someone had taught it. Someone had organized it. Someone had transformed military knowledge into a system that could survive long after individual commanders disappeared. That system continued to shape the United States long after the Revolution ended. The Blue Book remained the foundation of American military training for decades. Young officers who had never met von Steuben still learned procedures he had written. New recruits practiced drills whose origins stretched back to the frozen parade grounds of Valley Forge. Generations changed. The manual endured. Its influence extended far beyond ceremonial marching. The principles of standardized instruction, clear chains of command, officer responsibility, camp organization, and disciplined battlefield maneuver became permanent features of the United States Army. As the nation expanded westward, fought new wars, and established permanent military institutions, traces of von Steuben's work remained embedded within them. His greatest achievement was never a battlefield victory. It was continuity. He had created a professional framework capable of outliving him. Congress eventually acknowledged that debt. Although his road to recognition was often frustratingly slow, the United States granted him citizenship and awarded him land in New York in recognition of his extraordinary service. There, near what is now Steuben, New York, he spent much of his final years surrounded by former aides and friends who had become something like family. He died on November 28, 1794. There was no grand palace, no immense fortune, no kingdom to return to, only the respect of a nation that understood, perhaps more clearly with each passing year, that its army would not have become what it was without him. Today, visitors to Valley Forge National Historical Park often focus on the log huts, the harsh winter, or George Washington's headquarters. Those places deserve their fame. But somewhere between those frozen parade grounds and the victories that followed lies a quieter story. It is the story of repetition, of thousands of soldiers loading and reloading empty muskets until every movement became instinct. Of officers learning that rank meant responsibility, not privilege. Of camps organized to keep disease from spreading. Of commands repeated until men from 13 different states responded as one. None of those moments looked dramatic. Together, they changed the war. And that brings us back to the question that opened this story. Was Baron von Steuben a fraud? If the question concerns his reputation upon arriving in America, the answer is complicated. The recommendation that introduced him undeniably created an inflated impression of his position within the Prussian Army. Many Americans believed they were receiving one of Frederick the Great's senior generals. They were not. Von Steuben had never held that rank. He never claimed the great battlefield victories later generations sometimes imagined. But if the question is whether he possessed the military knowledge those recommendations promised, history has already delivered its verdict. He understood discipline better than almost anyone Washington could have found. He understood organization when the Continental Army desperately lacked it. He understood that courage without structure could win skirmishes, but rarely won wars. Most importantly, he knew how to teach. Knowledge locked inside one brilliant officer changes very little. Knowledge passed to thousands of soldiers changes history. That is exactly what happened at Valley Forge. America did not win its independence because of one man. It won because countless soldiers endured years of hardship, because Washington refused to surrender after repeated defeats, because France entered the war, because British strategy faltered, and because thousands of ordinary people continued fighting when success seemed almost impossible. But when those soldiers finally stood their ground at Monmouth, when they marched with confidence toward Yorktown, when they proved they could fight as a professional army, they were carrying lessons first drilled into them by a man who, according to his papers, was more important than he really was. Until he wasn't. Because by the end of his life, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben no longer needed borrowed titles. He had earned something far greater than rank. He had earned a permanent place among the architects of American independence. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more overlooked people, forgotten battles, and extraordinary moments that shaped history, be sure to subscribe. And here's a question for you. Do you think history should judge von Steuben by the rank he claimed to have, or by the army he actually created? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.